for those of you that have been studying, is there a difference between showing property and holding an open house? And I'm referring legally or illegally, or as it all relates to the National Association of Realtors settlement and the buyer representation agreement requirement. Is there a difference between showing the, Michael Pine has his hand up. Ooh,
No,
what?
no,
No.
In an open house, you would be representing the seller until you established a buyer agency with a potential client. And in a showing, you would be acting on behalf of the buyer and would have to have an existing agreement in place.
Yeah. So, let's say you're not the listing agent. Does that change the rule?
No, you're still, your agency relationship is with your brokerage. And if your brokerage is representing the seller, you represent the seller indirectly until such time that you're an agent for another party.
Do you want to represent a buyer that you meet at the open house?
Ideally, you would want to refer that out because you don't want to run into dual agency issues.
All right. All right. Let's, I'm ending the poll. All right. And we're going to share the results. So I don't know if you can see on the screen the poll. Can you, does it say working with sellers and the questions?
Yeah, it shows it.
Okay, good, thank you. I just don't necessarily know. Because I can see more than, you know. So can a listing agent also represent the buyer in the transaction? The answer is yes, if the buyer agrees to it. Everybody got that right. Congratulations. What additional document must a listing agent have if they are to represent both the seller and the buyer? And the answer is a buyer broker agreement. Now, those of you that chose a dual agency contract, I have a mission for you, which is to go into the California Association of Realtors, go into Zip Forms, add a form, and find a dual agency contract. Find one. And when you have, show it to me because it's not there. No, it's not there. But if you're going to represent a buyer in a transaction and a seller, you're going to need two things. You're going to need an agreement with the seller that says you're going to be paid a certain amount to represent the seller, and you're going to need a buyer representation agreement. The standard purchase agreement is an agreement really between the buyer and the seller and not the agents, and it would not constitute a buyer representation agreement. Number 3, which of the following determines the listing agent's compensation when they also represent the buyer? And most of you got this right. It is both the listing contract and the buyer broker contract, which is sort of related to what we just said, in that you would have 2 contracts if you are representing the buyer and the seller. A listing agent can represent both the seller and the buyer without any additional documentation. That is false. Because if you're representing the buyer, we're assuming you are representing the buyer, you need a buyer representation agreement with the buyer. If the listing agent is acting as a dual agent, what must be clearly outlined in the buyer broker contract? And the answer is the amount of compensation for representing the buyer. The buyer broker contract doesn't get into the commission you're going to get for representing the seller. The National Association of Realtors settlement does not say, this is, I understand, counterintuitive, but it does not say that the buyer representation agreement has to go to the duties and responsibilities of the agent. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea, and most of the agreements written by the lawyers include it. But what the settlement says is that the amount of compensation for representing the buyer must be clearly stated. 6, the listing agent's compensation for representing the buyer is automatically included in the listing contract. false, right? The listing contract does not automatically include, we're going to look at the listing contract in a few minutes. What separate agreements are necessary for a listing agent to act as a dual agent? Again, a lot of you want the dual agency disclosure form. Find that. I'd like to see it. But the answer is a buyer broker contract and a listing agreement. That's what you need. The purchase agreement does not make you a listing agent. The listing agreement and a purchase agreement doesn't make you a buyer agent. It's the buyer broker contract and the listing agreement. So by the way, particularly if you're on my team, talk to me and Rob when you talk to us, right? When we're writing this. What would the listing agent discuss with the seller regarding their compensation if they act as a dual agent? And the answer would be the total compensation, including both the seller and buyer sides. You just would have to disclose that. All right, wasn't that fun? All right, I'm sharing the results with the California broker team at EXP. Maybe not. All right.
Michael, how does that affect when the buyer doesn't want to be represented by the agent?
That's yeah. That's coming up. So if you want, let me do this now. So I've got too many things open. That's not it. How about this? So I'm going to share this, and I have to give permissions. And then I have to figure out where to chat. And I'll be catching up on posting all this on the different, on the tube of you as well as workplace. So while we're talking about that, this I don't think we need. All right, let me get rid of this. All right. Anything else here? All right. So the question was, what if the buyer doesn't want to be represented? This is the new residential listing agreement. Now, those of you that are familiar with the previous residential listing agreement, the first big difference is that it's in a grid format like the residential purchase agreement has been, which the CAR lawyers think it's an improvement. So why don't we go ahead and talk about this now? Then we're going to circle back to some of the EXP agreements and other things. But note the beginning is the listing period, not to exceed 24 months if in 1 to 4 not owned by an entity. There used to be agents that would have listing agreements for years, right? Almost perpetuity, right? But the most is only 2 years. If you can't sell it in 2 years, now you can get an extension, but that's it. If it involves a manufactured home, probate, or conservator, we just check those boxes because otherwise there isn't much difference. The paragraph C are the magic words required by the California Civil Code that say you have to put in any agreement to pay a real estate agent a commission. We're now getting to the good stuff and the answer to the question. Compensation to seller's broker. Now, in the past, you might have listed homes for 6% and 5%, and then you would pay the other agent out of, your 5 or 6%. And a lot of times sellers, sometimes they cared how much you were giving to the other agent. Sometimes they didn't care all that much. There was a place in the listing agreement that said, I'm going to pay the buyer's agent X amount or Y amount, but to the seller, they're giving you 5, 5.5, 6%, that sort of thing. Now that's gone. in the sense that the amount of compensation that would go to a buyer's agent is not included here. There was this big brouhaha because, is that a tech? Anyhow, because Leo Perea, the CEO of EXP, said that in EXP, we're not splitting commissions with buyer's agents. And people are like, oh my God, EXP is not going to pay buyer's agents. They're telling their agents don't pay buyer's agents, and there were actually recruiting calls being made by competitors saying, hey, why do you want to work for a company that won't pay buyer's agents commissions? Just so you realize that the California Association of Realtors have done exactly the same thing. And they did it for exactly the same reason. And the reason they did it, that the heart of the NAR legal issues was the splitting of commission. And I've listened to 3 different lawyers from the California Association of Realtors, which is why I'm a little punchy, but 3 different lawyers explaining this, and they said exactly what Leo said, which is if we keep splitting commissions, we're going to need more attorneys because there's going to be another lawsuit. So to the California Association of Realtors legal department has taken the position, it's not that the seller can't pay a buyer's agent. It's just that it isn't going to be split in the listing agreement. Does everybody understand that? So if you were going to list it for 5 and keep 2.5 and put 2.5 in for the buyer's agent, then you'd be writing in 2.5 here. Right? 2.5. And if any, you could write in a dollar amount. Like how much? Well, or what? So you could, let's say you're asking the seller to pay a transaction coordinator fee, something like that. You could say, and $400, $500. So this C1 is how much you're going to get as a listing agent. That's it. Notice C2. And Rod and I have been modifying the forms for writing an offer and for doing a listing to make them, because of the changes. So if you're a listing agent, and we're going to be providing, tomorrow we're going to talk about scripts, and I'm going to do a little bit today. But what I'd be saying to a seller is, look, historically, sellers always could have paid buyer's agents $1 or nothing. But they choose as a strategic choice to offer compensation to a buyer's agent in order to, motivate them, incentivize them in helping you sell the property. Because 95% of all the buyers have agents and we want them to show the property and we want them to sell the property. The logic for doing so has not changed. What has changed under the new rules is that I, as the listing agent, aren't going to be the middleman or middlewoman or middle person or whatever you want to say. In other words, in the past, you would have paid me 5%, 6%. I would have paid the other agent 2.5% or 3%, but we can't do that anymore. I'm not the middleman between you and compensating the other agent. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. However, the question still comes up, what if a buyer contacts me and says, I want to see the house. I'm interested in the house. And I say to the buyer, well, great, have your agent contact me. Your agent can open the door. And the buyer says, I don't have an agent. Now, I've got one of the things I could say is, well, I could be a dual agent. But if I'm going to be a dual agent, then that means that, first of all, the buyer is going to have to agree to compensate me. And what if the buyer says, well, I don't want to do that? The reason I want you and not a buyer's agent is so I don't have to pay anything for a buyer. I want you to do it. I don't want to pay anything. I'm not going to sign a buyer rep agreement. I want you to sell me the house. So what I would be saying to the seller is now it's going to happen is that I'm going to have to take on additional responsibility. I'm not only going to be doing the job I traditionally do when I list a property on behalf of the seller, but I'm also going to be doing the job that the buyer's agent would have for the buyer. I'm going to have to show them the property. I'm going to have to show up and let them in for inspections. I'm going to have to help them fill out the forms. I'm going to have to make sure they sign everything. I'm going to have to make sure that they're doing what they need to do on time, et cetera, et cetera. And because I'm going to be taking on additional responsibilities, I should be compensated for that. Now, one of the agents that I've talked to, who I like his style, I'm not going to mention his name, but he traditionally charges 6% commission. And he keeps 3.5 on the listing side and would put 2.5 in the MLS. And so he was asking me, well, what should he do here? And I said, if you want, write in 2.5 if you represent the buyer too. And he said, sounds good to me. So this is somebody who's been around a while and is kind of smooth, but you understand, what would you want if you double ended a transaction? What would you want extra besides the listing side? That's what you would write in here. Right? You're doing extra work. You should be paid extra. Now, this is what I believe that is quite likely that going forward, sellers are going to pay buyers agents compensation through a concession or otherwise. And the reason is if the buyer doesn't have their own agent representing them, they're going to have to pay the listing agent more. And it increases the likelihood of them being sued. Because, what is it? 71% of all lawsuits involving real estate is when you only have one agent in the transaction. So the unrepresented buyer is going to say, well, the only agent was the listing agent and she worked for the seller and didn't really help me, and now I'm unhappy and I'm going to sue. Any questions about that? There's no place here to write in a buyer's agent compensation. That doesn't mean you can't talk about it, but not here.
Michael, I have a question. Do you would you have another agent have the buyer broker with the agent with the buyer's paying, but not to avoid dual agency?
You're breaking up, but if your question is, would it be prudent to have another agent represent the buyer instead of you so you avoid dual agency? There are a lot of agents that do that. Not me, because I was greedy. I mean, I was, cost effective. But there are many agents that won't do dual agency because of an increased chance of litigation. If you're representing both the buyer and the seller, you need to make sure that every possible inspection and report is run. Everything. I've had cases where the buyer said, I don't need a termite report. I went and got one anyhow. And if it says in the property inspection, you ought to have a plumber look at this leak, get a plumber to look at the leak and give a bid. Everything. Because what those suits are always involve is the failure to disclose or perceived failure to disclose a material fact. And if you're representing the buyer and the seller and you're missing the roof inspection, you never had a contractor look at the cracks in the foundation, and now they have a $50,000 foundation bill, you're going to meet lawyers. The continuation C3, stop me if there's a question. C3, and most of this is the same as the old listing agreement. So I'm not going to go through every line, but C3 is what was called the broker safety clause, the broker protection clause. Now they're calling it a continuation period, which is what if my listing ends Friday? It's the end of my listing term. And Friday, some buyers, I'm showing them the property and they seem really, really interested. And I say, well, you want to write an offer? and they're like, well, we're gonna think about it over the weekend, I have a problem. The problem is my listing is going to expire midnight on Friday. So Monday, when they drive by the property, they're gonna notice my sign is no longer there. And they're gonna go knock on the door. And when the owner answers the door, they're gonna say, what's going on? We saw your property last week. We were interested in making an offer. Now the sign is gone. Do you still want to sell? Right? And the owner says, well, yeah. As a matter of fact, I do. Come on in. So what this continuation period clause, and there's also one for buyer representation, is that the agent has to give a list of the people that they're negotiating with. And for whatever number you write in 30, 60, 90 days, whatever number you write in, if those people come and buy the property, then you get paid. However, you'll notice if it's relisted with another agent, then it doesn't work. In all the years I've been in real estate, which is a really, really long time, I've never heard of anybody ever collecting on this clause. Never. And I have agents that spend time worrying about how many days they write in. And I'm like, just, don't, put in 30, don't worry about it. Have you listed your property with other brokers? No. And you see what C4 is really getting at, are there any protection period? I'm stuck with the old names. Is there any continuation period people that you are obligated to pay a commission to another agent if those people buy the property? So do you have any obligation? Like, do you still have a continuation period running? Items to be included, go ahead, check the boxes, write them in. This does not determine what is included. The MLS does not determine what is included. The property flyer does not determine what is included. The website, the single property website, does not determine what is included. What determines what is included in the sale is the residential purchase agreement. Got a paragraph that says that. Doesn't matter what the listing agreement says. No one's going to see this anyhow. But this is so that you can have the conversation with the seller, so you put the right stuff in the MLS. Is there a chat question that I need to? All right. MLS and public marketing, generally, people want it in the MLS. Now, the MLSA is a form coming up, the Multiple Listing Service Addendum, new form, yay. So you would write in your primary MLS, and you could write in others if you wanted to. So usually we just write in our primary MLS. The primary MLS generally syndicates information to other MLSs, but not necessarily all of it and not necessarily to everyone. I've noticed on my EXP website that there's now, actually Michael Pine noticed it first and told me that there's CRMLS listings on my website, even though I'm not a member of CRMLS, but CRMLS and MLS listings have worked out some sort of an arrangement. Also, there's Tahoe listings. So what that means is my website includes properties from other MLSs. But anyhow, I wouldn't worry about it. I just write it in here. Presentation of offers. There are two theories. One is we're going to set a date. We're going to say we're going to take offers on a given date. And we're going to put that in the MLS and we're going to put it here. Just so you realize, if you're the listing agent and you say that we're not going to look at offers until 2 Tuesdays from now, and somebody makes a preemptive offer and the seller accepts it, and you put it in as pending, that what's been happening is the agents who were following the rules and waiting will file an ethics complaint against you for lying on the MLS, for being unfair, deceitful, and unethical. And they're starting to beat up listing agents who say we're not taking offers to a given day and then take offers. Just saying, right? So old school used to be send us an offer when you got one. It's a horse race. First person to give us an offer we like. The reason for setting a date is that it would give everybody a chance to bid. But if you preemptive offers is an issue. Right, I'm just saying, right? If you say you're not going to look at offers, don't look at offers. However, you need the instructions from the seller. The Business and Professions Code says that as a real estate agent, you're obligated to present all offers immediately and at the same time to the seller, unless instructed in writing to do otherwise. And that's where you'd be instructed to do otherwise. Love letters. This is where the buyer writes a letter and they, are saying, you want we really love your house and here's pictures of our family and look how cute our children are and well, that sort of stuff. There's a problem potentially, and the problem is that if the buyer is trying to get the seller to sell to the buyer based upon race, color, creed, national origin, sexual orientation, ancestry, and other things, that's a violation of fair housing laws. And so I've seen cases where the seller had, let's just say, religious icons and things in the house. And so the buyers went and got their picture taken in front of their church, waving, like, hey, basing your decision on who to sell your property to based on religion violates fair housing laws. Just saying, right? So it's safer not to take them if you're the seller, because what will happen is, let's say there are two offers made, and let's say that one buyer ethnically is more similar to the seller's, and the other buyer's offer is not accepted, and when escrow closes, they find out that they offered more than the first one. You're going to meet lawyers. I would tell the seller, you're going to meet lawyers if you're basing the decision on other than what the contract says. What reports, this is important, natural hazard disclosure is already checked because there's a California law, federal, that says you have to do this. Now, if I'm listing the property, I would go out of my way to get a termite report, a property inspection, HOA documents, the prelim, a roof, if it's got a pool, the pool, if it's got a septic or sewer, to get it. And if there's something else that I could think of, I would put them in. Now, you may have heard me talk about this, but in intense markets like Silicon Valley, 90% of all the listings have all that stuff. They have all of them. And that's because we want the buyer to make an offer without inspection as a contingency. You drive for an hour or two away from Silicon Valley and the thing flips around where most of them don't. But that's a big mistake because it gives the buyer the right to renegotiate the price once they get the reports. And it also means they have an inspection contingency, which is a get out of escrow free card. Exceptions to ownership and title, usually don't write anything in here, but I've had cases where I noticed that the person I was talking to was not the only person that was on the preliminary title report or in the tax records. There was another name in addition to hers. Who's that? Oh, that's my brother. Don't worry about him. He'll sign. Okay. Hopefully that's true, right? Seller opts out of a sign or a lockbox. Not common, but they can do it. I've had people say, well, I don't want to put a sign in front of my property. I don't want the neighbors to know I'm selling the house. I'm like, they're going to know. I mean, first of all, they're going to see all these people driving up, going in, driving away, driving up, going in, driving away. They'll think you're dealing drugs or something. You might as well put up a for sale sign. Additional addenda, the broker compensation advisory is the only one that's actually included here. We're not going to go through the whole form because, you know, if you have insomnia, you could do it. There's a more of an explanation on the love letters. There is more stuff for you to read and think about. But that's that form. Here's the multiple listing service addendum. And it's now in the old form, there was a lot of the stuff included because there's a great big boxed area that talked about MLS and clear cooperation and none of that, right? And so that's been extracted from the residential listing agreement and given its own addendum. And it talks about why you should have the MLS and what does clear cooperation mean and what does coming soon mean. Now, what that issue is in MLS listings, we have something called members only, which doesn't appear on Zillow and Redfin and things like that. Coming soon, depending on your MLS, might appear on Zillow and Redfin. So the downside is that if you're saying, well, it's coming soon in 2 weeks, when you really launch it, it already shows on Zillow and Redfin and Realtor.com that it's been on the market 2 weeks and hasn't sold. The days on market appears longer. Now, seller instructs broker to market the property to the public at the beginning of the listing period or two to write in a date. So the seller says, well, you know, we're not ready for people to look at the property. Right. What you want to do is get them to sign the listing because you'll tell them there are things I need to do that I can't do without you hiring me. Like, you know, opening up escrow and getting the prelim and starting to collect all the disclosures and reports and getting everything ready and getting the marketing. You got to hire me before I'm going to do all that stuff. Now, that doesn't mean that if you hire me today, we're going to start inviting people tomorrow to look at the property. We can delay that and you would write in. If the seller says, I don't want you to market the property to the public, there's an SELM form. I think I have an example in that folder. But, you know, generally this would be an exclusive and it would be for a certain period of time. Why would anybody do that? They're famous. I've had clients that had people that were sick in the property and they didn't want people coming by, right? I mean, they didn't want people to know, they didn't want it on the internet, they didn't want to. Now, one of the parts here that I would be discussing is called seller concessions. And what this is an explanation. And the default setting is, we're not going to put it on the MLS. But there's a box you could check that says we're going to put it on the MLS. Now, in the material I've given you, I've converted things, which means that some of the, what do I want? I want this to be editing. I know, am I in the wrong copy? Is this a, let me go in here. Well, all right. Let me go back to where I was. And this is a PowerPoint that I uploaded, but for purposes of making this easier for me to modify it, I'm going to open it up in Google Slides. So this is something I've been working on for a while. And yeah, there we go. All right. And so you can, I'm going to be incorporating some of this into the listing presentation. And what it talks about is a little bit about the history, that there's never been a set commission, and how much commissions have always been negotiable. And what I would say to a seller is, I've been on a lot of listing appointments, and I'll tell you, commissions are negotiable, because I was being negotiated with practically every single time. And then this is who really pays. which is simply a discussion that all the money that goes into escrow comes from the buyer and the buyer's lender. That as a seller, you're not going to put any money in. You're just going to get money out. And so in the sense of who's actually putting in the money that pays for everything, the answer is that's the buyer. The buyer is paying their agent's commission, they're paying my commission, they're paying their closing costs, they're paying your closing costs. All the money comes from the buyer. And they build that into the price for a reason. And then this is a slide I put together to explain to a seller that buyers have closing costs too. Many of which you can't see in the transaction because, and by the way, one of the classes we're going to be doing is about how to do a net sheet for the seller. And one of the things that I would do if I were, first of all, you always should have a net sheet for the seller. You should learn how to use the software that makes net sheets. If you can't do that, you're going to get the title company to run you a range of them so you can take them with you. But in addition to giving a seller a net sheet, I would also be giving the seller a copy of what a typical buyer closing cost would look like. And they range between 2 and 5% of the loan amount. And here's just an example of some of the things that they might have to spend. Now, this is, and I used to have it where there were 4 or 3 different charts, but I made them smaller. The purpose of this is to explain that many buyers may need help financing their closing costs. Now, what I did in these different charts is I went back 10 years, which is about the time period that somebody thinks of selling, right? They've owned it for 10 years. So 10 years ago, what were interest rates like? Well, they were under 4%. Where are they now? They're closer to 7%. So what's happened since you bought your home is interest rates have gone way, 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 way up. What's also happened since you bought your home on the median price of a home in California, it's gone way, 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 way up, right? It's gone up 6.52% a year. And what also has been happening since you bought your home is that the affordability index has gone down. When you bought your home 10 years ago, almost 50% of all the people in California could afford a median price home. It's 17% right now. So what that means is the buyer might need help. And what they want to do is to finance their closing costs. And in order to do that, they roll it into the price. So that, how would they roll their closing costs, including a cooperating buyer agent compensation? They would ask for a seller concession. And so even though it explains that in that form, this is, it's a contribution. By the way, those of you that have had listings, do sellers sometimes pay for the NHD report? Do sellers pay for a home warranty? Do sellers pay, in some cases, for title and escrow? Do sellers pay for homeowner association documents? Do sellers, you get where I'm going with it. It's not uncommon for sellers to pay buyer closing costs because buyers are scraping up every dime they can just to make the down payment. Now, if this is useful to you, this shows what the different lenders will allow. Now, the commissions don't count against these limits. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA have affirmed that seller payment of buyer agents' commissions will continue to be excluded from limits on seller concessions. In other words, the lenders have said that you giving a concession to compensate a buyer's agent, who brings, by the way, a ready, willing, and able buyer willing to purchase the property on a price and terms you like, is a traditional thing. It's just like it's always been, and it's not considered a real loan concession. Also, the benefits as a seller to giving concessions, it's going to give you a competitive advantage. It's going to increase the buyer purchasing power, and it's going to result in higher prices. How would that happen, do you say? Well, if the buyer can build the compensation to their agent into escrow, then let's say the buyer says, well, I'm willing to offer you $800,000, but I need 20,000, a 2.5% concession to pay my agent. You're going to net 780. Seller says, no, not going to do it. Don't want to do it. I read on the internet, I don't have to do it. It's illegal. I'm not going to do it. Okay. Now the buyer may not be able to offer 800,000. And so they say, all right, well, if we have to pay our agent off on the side, then we can only offer 780, although in reality, it would be probably less than that. And we're now going to pay $20,000 to our agent. So how does that change your net? They lowered the price because this has increased their out-of-pocket expenses, which diminishes the buyer's purchasing power. And one of the things that I would point out to sellers, the premise of the NAR settlement was that if buyers were paying their agent a commission outside of escrow, sellers would lower their price. Because it isn't included. All those comps you've been looking at for the last 6 months included a commission to an agent. So what's the difference? I probably would want to improve my the background and all that, but it converted. So if a buyer has a loan, and let's say it's an 80% loan, and 20,000 is the amount they're paying their agent. If that's added, and this is the phrase I would use, added to their offer, then 80% of the $20,000 is being financed as well. Out of pocket, the buyer is only going to have to come up with an additional $4,000 because 80% is coming from the lender. If the buyer has a 90% loan, and it's a $20,000 commission, they only have to come up with $2,000 out of pocket because 90% of it is being paid by the lender. But if you say, no, I don't want you to do that, it means that both of those buyers are going to have to come up with an additional $20,000 over and above their down payment, over and above their closing costs, in addition to everything else. Now, on an 80% loan, that's 5 times as much out of pocket. And on a 90% loan, it's 10 times as much out of pocket. So it's not that they can then offer you 20,000 less. They're going to have to offer a lot less because you're not allowing them to finance their closing costs. You're not allowing them to do it. But that's what they want to do. They'll pay you more if you allow them to add those costs to their offer and finance it. How about if the listing agent does it? Well, why don't you just handle everything? Now we're back to that other discussion. So if I have to perform all the jobs of all the buyer's agents, I have to be the one that chose the property, right? Really? I have to write all the contracts. I have to manage the transaction. You're going to have to pay me more, and litigation is likely to go up because the buyers don't have representation. Be strategic. How about this? Some sellers may just refuse to cooperate. But what that's going to do is diminish the enthusiasm of buyers' agents to sell the property. It also is going to diminish the enthusiasm of buyers to buy the property, because basically you're saying, if you buy my house, you're going to have a much bigger closing cost than you would if you bought my neighbor's house. If we make it clear that you're willing to consider concessions, it's going to give you a competitive advantage. Agents are going to be incentivized. Buyers are going to be more interested. Buyers can make higher offer. More of them will be attracted. And you can wait and see if you like the offer. You're not obligating yourself to pay anything at this point. All we're saying is, why don't we tell the universe we're open to looking at offers that involve compensation. And then I would also emphasize to a seller, keep your eyes on the prize. Because when we're evaluating an offer, it's not just, well, is there a concession or not? How much am I netting? How good is their financing? What contingencies do they have? What about other terms? I need to stay, I need to rent back, what other terms are included in the offer? We should be looking at the whole package rather than just saying, I don't want to pay anybody a concession. I just don't want to do it. So we want to be strategic. There may be more slides than you need. I've noticed that just now. But, more exposure. If you're broker friendly, more exposure means more buyers, which means a better price in terms. Right? And then there's, so I may modify this again. I'm incorporating this into a listing presentation that's available to everybody that's on the team. All right. So this also, I think, is in the package, the folder. The first thing is the eXp Realty Seller Toolkit, which you might want to look at. It's got net sheets and things like that, but I would be using the title company app, which makes really nice looking ones with the title company. But you can see here are some resources. Now, if you're not with eXp, and let's see, are there pictures of when we depart? I don't know. I'll do this as soon as I can. But soon. If you're not at eXp, you might be saying, well, how does this help me? And by the way, there's copies of eXp agreements as well in that folder. And the answer is eXp has made its toolkit available to agents from all denominations. And we didn't copyright any of our forms. This is all open source. Now, you might be wondering, well, why would you do that? And the answer is we realize that your broker may not know what they're doing yet or really be prepared for the changes. And all they have is what the California Association of Realtors has provided, which in some senses isn't all that great. In fact, if you Google search eXp Realty versus California Association of Realtors, you're going to find podcasts, articles, etc., talking about how eXp is way further ahead on the forms and the training and the scripts than the California Association of Realtors. And so if you're not with eXp, I just want you to know we feel sorry for you. Right? We do. And we're providing this, trying to help you catch up. And if you would like to really catch up, reach out to me and we can talk. So other things that I put in, these are from some slides. And what it's referring to is, and this is from some of eXp's material, right? There's the toolkit. So some of what I've already covered. Listing agents at the time can negotiate they could negotiate both sides. What is now, listing agents only negotiate the listing side. Now, one strategy would be for you to negotiate your compensation as a listing agent first, and then negotiate additional compensation if there's an unrepresented buyer. Now, you'll notice that's very similar to the California Association of Realtors, except our form is in 12-point type and much shorter and much easier to explain. Part of what CAR has been shaded for is their forms are very complicated, very lengthy, and even people that teach at law schools find them confusing and difficult to follow. By the way, where it says other here, you don't write in 2.5% to the buyer's agent. Right? You can't write in anything, but notice this would be just like the CAR information on unrepresented buyers. Strategy 2 would be, what if the seller says, look, I bought and sold homes. By the way, do you know who has said, I've bought and sold a lot of homes and I see the value in the agents. I see value in paying buyer's agents, and I have never negotiated the agent's commission. Do you know who made that statement recently? A guy named Warren Buffett, right, where he said that he never tried, even though he bought lots of properties. And the last one he sold was $7 million. He said he's never negotiated real estate agent commissions down, never, because he saw the value. So what if the seller says, I know the value of offering something to a buyer's agent? And by the way, I think a lot of smart sellers are going to say, yeah, I want them, you know. In paragraph 21, you could write it in. Now, this doesn't mean they are obligated, because they still have to get an offer. But it means up front, the seller could say, tell the other agents, if I like their offer, I'll give them 2.5, I'll give them 3. Tell them I want you to. Well, we could write that in. Now, what it's saying here under seller concessions is simply that you should expect for this to be written in the contract for all the reasons that I gave on the other one. All right. This is one of the lines that is part of our script. Sometimes buyers will need assistance in financing their costs, which is the essence of it. And it's all about net, which you should always have a net sheet on a listing appointment. And as I said, you should also show them how much the buyer is going to have to pay as well. Just because they're thinking, because their net only shows their numbers when they see that the buyer also has numbers too. Can you advertise? Let's say your seller says, I want to pay 2.5%. I do. I want you to tell everybody. Can you put it in the MLS? The answer is no. Can you put it in a document or website directly linked from the MLS? The answer is no. 2 clicks. Click 1 in the MLS. Click again, and then you could say it. Could you put it on a for sale sign? Answer is yes. You could have broker friendly, commission 2.5%. You could put it on a for sale sign. Could you put it on a flyer? The answer is yes. Can you put it on a voicemail when agents call you about the listing and it says, hey, if you're interested in my listing on Greenwood Drive, I just want you to know the seller's willing to pay 2.5% concession if he likes your offer. Yeah, you can do that. Can you go to a broker tour and hand out flyers, and when you're asked to pitch your listing, say, and my client has agreed to pay a 2.5% commission if you bring an offer that he likes? Can you do? The answer is yes. You can do all that. But you can't do it in the multiple listing service or in anything directly linked to the multiple listing service or any website that contains a multiple listing service IDX feed. Direct compensation. This is a EXP form. And basically what we're saying is you're agreeing to pay the buyer broker directly a percentage. Now, this may seem like semantics. We're not going to split our commission, but that doesn't mean that the seller can't pay a commission. It's just that it's not going through us as an intermediary. It's direct compensation from the seller. It could be 2.5% of the purchase price, right? And this is something that we would be more likely to be doing when we know we have an offer, because notice it says the undersigned seller agrees to compensate the undersigned real estate brokerage company, buyer's broker, for its procurement of the buyer of the property. Compensation shall only become due and payable upon completion of any transaction between seller and buyer. Right? So we just want to make it clear that as an EXP agent, the seller isn't giving us the money so that we can turn around and give it to the buyer's agent. Can you represent a buyer on my own listings if you want to, but only if the seller say it's okay. You're not required, if you're showing your own listing or at an open house, But it is required if you expect to be paid for representing the buyer. If you expect to get something for writing up an offer for the buyer on your own listing, you need a buyer broker agreement. What else did I put in the magic little folder? There's a frequently asked questions. This is for EXP. You can see copies. The amendment is what if you have a listing right now and things are changing? This is what the EXP listing agreement looks like. You'll notice it doesn't say EXP Realty copyright or anything like that. It doesn't say that. If you want to borrow, steal, go ahead. Right. But you'll see, notice the print is bigger and it's a lot easier. And you might find, by the way, if you're an EXP agent, you have a choice. You can use the EXP residential listing agreement, or you can use the California Association of Realtors. You have a choice. And the California brokers are explaining both of them. Most of this is just very similar. The buyer list is back to that, protection period. There's a paragraph about seller concessions. It just says what they are. Authority to promote. We have an exclusive inventory. Do you want us to promote it there? Do you want it on the MLS? Do you want a for sale sign? Do you want us to take pictures? Broker is or is not authorized to disclose the existence of offers. By the way, the residential listing agreement from CAR says that the broker is authorized to disclose the existence of other offers. And by the real estate agents who have never read the contract will say it's illegal, unethical, and immoral for the listing agent to tell you if they've got other offers and how much they are. That is not what the residential listing agreement says. It is not what the possible representation of more than one buyer or seller disclosure says. It is not what the statewide buyer and seller advisory says. All of them say they're not confidential, and you might, they might tell other people what your offer is. If I'm representing the seller, I would say there is sometimes a strategic advantage to me being able to tell an agent, you need to beat this amount. Yes, we already have an offer for 1.2 if you beat it. And then somebody comes in with a higher one, and then another agent calls me. I have worked it up over $100,000 in a day and a half by disclosing to every agent who called me where we were at and telling them, if you want to get the listing, if you want to buy the house, you're going to have to offer more than this. And then they'd say, oh, thank you. And then they would get an offer higher. And then I'd tell the next agent the same thing. Property showings and access, broker services, seller commitment, fixtures to be included. Nice, simple form, isn't it? Nice and easy. Right? Nice and easy. And the California brokers and EXP are explaining, they're going through it too. So clarifying, you would have to wait to have direct compensation from the seller signed at time of offer. Yeah, Michelle, because whether or not the seller is going to pay the buyer's agent anything would depend upon the offer. They don't start out obligated to pay a certain amount. They can say, I'm willing to pay a certain amount, but they're not obligated until they get an offer and they like it. Mr. Pine has raised his hand.
Yeah, quick question. If two individuals own a property, are they both authorized to sell independently? Like, can you begin with one signature, or are you always required to have both signatures?
Good question. So legally, a listing agreement is not actually a real estate contract. I know that sounds weird. It's a personal services agreement. It's an employment agreement. It's an agreement it's not an agreement to sell real estate. It's an agreement to pay a commission to a real estate agent who brings in a ready, willing, and able buyer willing to make an offer on the exact terms of the listing. In that sense, a listing agreement legally would be like hiring a pool cleaner. or somebody like that. It's either, let's say there's a married couple or co-owners. Any one of them could sign a legally valid listing agreement. Any one of them. Because now, by the way, you can't record a listing. You can record a purchase agreement if it's been notarized, but not a listing because it doesn't affect title to or possession of property. It's not a real estate contract, it's a service agreement. Now, so legally, one spouse, one owner can sign a listing and it's legally a valid listing. The issue is that most MLSs have a MLS rule that says that if you put the listing into the MLS, they want everybody to have signed the listing agreement that owns the property, because what would happen is another agent brings an offer and the other owner says, well, I really don't want to sell. And I never signed a listing. I didn't even know that they were trying to sell the property. I don't want to sell the property. So the MLS says you're supposed to have all signatures, but outside of the MLS, it's not a legal requirement.
Thank you.
All right. Julio, any other questions? Tomorrow we're going to talk about scripts. Isn't that fun? Wasn't that fun? You know, we're going to talk about how you would explain seller concessions to a seller. All right. Goodbye, y'all. Have a good day.
Sounds
Bye,
good,
Michael.
Michael. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.